I look at myself as kind of an accountability partner and again, leading by example. So when I talk to anybody in the organization about leadership action plans, I just tend to lead with some of my goals and objectives.
How valuable is it to hold yourself accountable to the same expectations you have of those you are leading? I'm your host, Tim Spiker, and this is the Be Worth Following podcast, a production of the People Forward Network. On this show, we talk with exceptional leaders, thinkers, and researchers about what actually drives effective leadership across the globe and over time. You just heard from Jason Lippert, President and CEO of Lippert Components. What was once a small family roofing business has become a leading global manufacturer and supplier of engineered components to the RV, marine, and automotive industries. Today, Lippert, known as LCI Industries on the New York Stock Exchange, is a publicly traded company that has annual sales of over $5 billion US. Some of you may have already picked up on something unique about the Lippert story. Yes, this was originally a family-owned business that is now publicly traded, and yet Jason Lippert, same last name as the company, continues to be the CEO as he has been since 2003. Even as the company went public, the board of directors and investors have continued to see Jason as the right person to lead the company. This is a wildly rare occurrence for family-owned companies that end up being publicly traded. It's an amazing testament to Jason's capabilities and performance as a leader, and it points out why we should all be listening to and learning from Jason. During his tenure as CEO, Jason has made it a priority to use the business as a force for good. Even as the company has expanded and diversified through a bevy of acquisitions, Jason and Lippert have continued to place an enormous emphasis on being a people-first culture and organization. In our conversation, Jason weighs in on the culture versus strategy debate. He talks about how leaders need to look after their teams, and he shares about something that is far too rare in the C-suite, that is, holding his direct reports and himself responsible for their leadership development plans as individuals on an annual basis. Jason attributes his leadership mindset to his faith and some early influences in his career, and that is where we begin our conversation.
There's a few things that come to mind. First, Jesus has been a big part of just my foundation. My dad has been a huge influence in my life. We were in the business together, so I got a lot of wisdom from him early on. Bob Chapman was responsible for our culture change back about a decade ago. But other than that, it's just been a lot of experiences. I've been in the business this year, started in the weld shop. We did a lot of welding and metal fabrication and just took a lot of steps growing from the front lines of the business to executive leadership. So,
I wonder if Bob were to hear that. That's quite a list of people to be included in. In fact, one of our guests had a similar experience, Lori Butts from Capital Credit Union. She had a personal experience with Bob coaching her. So Bob keeps popping up with his investment in leaders and having it be profound. But you mentioned you started by talking about your faith. Talk a little bit about how your perspective on faith and your relationship with Jesus. I bring it up because so many people that we have as a part of the podcast cite their faith as an important influence in how they lead. And we don't always go down that road, but let's go down it today. I just love to hear, and for folks to hear, how does that influence the way you think and the way that you lead?
There's a book called Lead Like Jesus, and it never really occurred to me the way he led made him one of the greatest leaders in history. So just looking at leadership principles, I would credit leadership and values to what's changed, our business for the better as we changed our culture. And if you look at the way Jesus led and who he was, that really sits at the foundation of our core values in our business. Servant leadership being one of our leadership qualities that we need out of every single leader we have. And we have found that the truer we stay to the values, the truer we stay to good leadership qualities, the better the business is. We just tend to keep more people over the long term because people, we know through research, people will stay more likely if there's good leaders around them, if it's a good culture, if there's values that are followed. So you look at all those things and you say, well, people stick around. Quality, safety, efficiency, innovation, and the business all get better because that's what happens when people stick around. And then the business gets better. So trace all that back to good leaders and good values. And that's, I think, what Jesus stood for.
So let's talk about servant leadership a little bit before we get into a lot more of your story and the Lippert story. Servant leadership is a term that a lot of people have heard over the years, or at least heard of. But in terms of practical application, what does that type of mentality look like for you on a day-to-day basis as somebody who's leading the organization?
Yeah, for me, I feel like for everybody else to really lean into servant leadership, the top level people that are leading the masses in a corporation our size, they need to be walking the talk. So for me, it's making sure that whether it's a human need out there by one of our team members or somebody in the community, some of the service organizations I'm a part of, or just leading as a servant leader in the business on my teams through a meeting or wherever I happen to be with team members, I think it's just how they see you lead. People know the difference between people that are serving their teams and taking from their teams, I think, or demanding from their teams. I think there's just a real stark difference between the two. And I think, it's easy for people to figure out which side of the fence their leader is on. So you just have to be selfless and be self-aware, and every situation is different and everybody's watching all the time. I think it's really important.
As I hear that answer from you, you're reminding me of a couple of other folks that we've had the pleasure of visiting with. If I go back in time a little bit, Andrew Larson shared with us about the culture in Gustavay Larson Company and two questions that he said he would just show up with and encourages people to show up with all the time, which is, how are you doing and how can I help? They just have a discipline around those two questions. And then it also makes me think of Mark Miller, who we had not long ago, and in fact just reran his episode recently because it was such a wonderful episode. He's in charge of high performance leadership at Chick-fil-A, and his perspective was, when I enter a room as a leader, as an influencer, how can I add value to people? And his main message was, if I enter the room with how can I add value to others, whether I succeed or not, at least in that moment, I've got to focus off of myself and onto other people just by having that mentality. So as you talk about leaders showing up as people who are there to help, people who are there to serve rather than be served.
Once people figure out, or you figure out what people need, then they're watching to see, okay, what are you going to do? And if you're showing up to help and your actions prove out that you're serving, then people will walk away and say, that's a good leader.
That is a really good point, because to go around, ask everybody how you can help and what do you need, and then do nothing, you might have been better off to never ask the question in the first place if you're not going to do anything about it.
It's true. Nothing frustrates team members more than people that act like they're showing up to help and then do nothing. It does more damage than asking the question in the first place.
How do we actually show up in our actions? I think it's such an important idea, because I do think that there are some up-and-coming leaders in business and in nonprofit who hear the idea of being one who gives and show up with language that suggests that, but aren't really in their heart of hearts committed to being that. There's a difference between talking and doing. There's a difference between having the idea and actually becoming somebody who gives. But before we move on, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, for sure. So I think you're hitting the nail right in the head. And I boiled it down to, how does your team member know that you care? I mean, there's a lot of talk. There's a lot of people that have values and they put them on the walls and they might talk about them every once in a while. But I boil it down to, how does a team member know that you care? And a few things that I point to in our organization is, we've got 30 people dedicated to culture and leadership development. They're not human resources. They're not part of the human resources team. They're specifically dedicated to culture and leadership development and community impact, for that matter, and their health and wellness. So we've dedicated resources for that. I think the other big thing we do in our organization that really sets us apart, and our team members can walk away at the end of the day knowing that and saying that we help them do leadership action plans. We help them do personal and professional growth plans each and every year. And when the frontline team member that's welding or putting a window together on an assembly line or putting a piece of furniture together, and that's their job, and we're helping them write down a personal and professional growth plan for their life, which helps them and their family and ultimately their team in the business. I think that's when people know that, hey, look, this company cares for me at a different level maybe than where I've been before.
Wow, that's tangible. I want to ask a follow-up question to that, because one of the things, if there are 30 people out there in the organization whose job it is to help us think about how do we maintain and improve the culture, how do we grow and develop leaders, and then you mentioned community impact and wellness in there as well. What do you do? My observation is, if you as the top leader in the organization say, okay, nope, that's all delegated to the other 30, we're going to pay attention to other stuff, then my perspective says that that doesn't land very well ultimately in the long term. So what do you do to make sure that you are on board and it's not just something that's sent off to the other 30 to figure out?
So there's a few things I can think off the top of my head. First, I visit a facility every week. I sit with a group of our team members on the front lines that are ultimately receiving how leadership falls throughout the organization when we're talking about the front lines of manufacturing in our business. And I sit with some of our mid-level and high-level leadership groups as well, but a lot of the times it's our frontline leaders at our manufacturing divisions, and it's showing up once a week. I've got to take time out to do it, to listen, to get that feedback. So that's one of the reasons I know I'm getting really good feedback from our team members, but also so they know that I think it's important because I've been out there talking about it every week for the last 7 years or so. That's one part of it. Secondly, a lot of the leaders in the business, they have to own it. Values have to be consistent. If values aren't consistent, literally hour to hour, the culture doesn't work. And then lastly, I'd say our team member surveys, we do 3 times a year in our business, which is probably most companies, I think, do 12 to 18 months, but we do them almost every quarter because we want that. And we get 96% or so participation back on those engagement surveys of 15,000 people. So you got to feel the heartbeat. You got to understand the feedback and know where you're at so you know what your next steps are going to be.
That is a consistency that I've not encountered. That kind of, we're going to do this 3 times a year. And you're right, most organizations don't do it nearly as often. You've mentioned a couple of times previously, and we're going to get to this culture shift that happened about a decade ago. And I want to spend some time talking about that. But before we get there, I want to go a little further back to 1997. Your father owns the company. It gets sold, publicly traded at that point. And the board decides that you're going to continue to be in the leadership. It's so unique because for a company to become publicly traded and then to hang on to the person who has the same last name, that's astoundingly rare. So talk a little bit about that process, because clearly those investors came in, the board operates in a publicly traded form as it should, and they say, Jason is the guy. Talk a little bit about that, because it's just such a rare thing to happen in that way.
No, it's a great question. I guess I just got lucky. Again, I roll back to my faith and just having a strong foundation, trying to do a lot of the right things, and focus was important. But I think, timing was on my side, the family side, the company side. We sold at the right time. 97 was before Sarbanes and before the public world really went. A lot of needed change in public businesses through the SEC, but we've also gone a little bit overboard in some cases too, I think. So if that would have happened 20 years later, I don't know that the board might have made that decision. It was kind of a first-time CEO that was part of the board, but they gave me a chance. I was in my mid-20s, and my dad kind of stayed on for a few years to give them some peace of mind that, hey, look, we'll transition this as good as we can. And then the other piece is we had the RV vision. So we weren't really doing RV business before Drew bought us, and that was one of the things they were making a bet on. So part of our strategy was a consolidation of some smaller players and things like that. So good combination between organic growth and consolidation of the supply chain, which hadn't been done in our industry. So they were willing to take a chance and worked out.
Well, here's what I know about publicly traded companies. If you started in that role in 1997, and last I checked, it's 2023. So if we look at the average tenure in the CEO position of publicly traded companies being somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 years, and you're about 23 years longer than that at this point, if their bet hadn't paid off, you would have been given the opportunity to do something else long ago. So certainly the bets that everybody placed at that point have paid off, because shareholders don't usually go for a 26-year timeline unless things are going well. Now, given that 26 years, it's not without change. And in 2013, about a decade ago, there was an organizational shift that took place for you that moved more towards the idea of a people-centered culture. Can you talk about what happened back at that time? Walk us through how the idea of the shift came up, and then how the organization went through it, and ultimately what were the outcomes?
Yeah, sure. So it was just after the recession. I'd been running the business for over a decade at that point in time. Over that decade, we had experienced growth in every way. Stock price growth, organic growth. We had inorganic growth and acquisitions. The number of team members we had were growing. And it just seemed year after year, okay, we move to the next, okay, how much more are we going to grow? How much more are we going to do? And it just, after the recession, we had to really consolidate. And at that point in time, we had laid a bunch of people off, because who was going to buy an RV in 2009 or 2010. So it was one of those things where I just started praying. That was part of it. It was a very repetitive pattern year after year and focus on growth and all this other stuff I just mentioned. What more is there? Searching for my purpose a little bit. And the answer came is I got a TED Talk right about that time around truly human leadership from Bob Chapman. And I listened to it, talked about how leaders can use the time that they've got in the business to really pour into people and help people be all that they can be in life, as opposed to just come in and put widgets together or whatever their job might be. And then I reached out to Bob. I read his book because he was a manufacturing company about the same size of us. At the time I read the book, he had done it 10 years ago and talked about all the different changes and phases. And after reaching out to him and asking him a lot of questions about, hey, look, we're going to do this. What were the most important things? He was kind enough to give us his time, and then we started on the journey, primarily centered around values and the consistency of living out values and holding people accountable to values day in and day out.
So many people might hear that and feel like it sounds like a campfire story. So you called Bob, you heard his TED Talk on truly human leadership, and then you mentioned his book, Everybody Matters. And then Bob says, yeah, and you visit with Bob a little bit, and then everybody lives happily ever after. And yet at the same time, you're talking about feeling a tangible shift at that point in time. So as Bob is coaching you and helping to point out to some of the things that Barry Wehrmiller had taken on to get where they got, can you recall back what were some of the bigger shifts that ended up happening as a result of this people-focused shift?
Initially, we didn't have core values before, so we launched our core values. We cascaded it to the entire organization almost at the same time throughout the organization. It's just going to be an expectation of every team member. We're not going to get to where we want culture-wise if we have different expectations for every different facility or every different team member around how well they adhere to the values and align to the values. So that was first and foremost. After that, we needed to establish leadership qualities and what we were going to expect out of our leaders. So the core values were for everybody. The leaders had a different set of qualities and values that they needed to live up to. Things like servant leadership as a leader, being courageous, being a motivating leader. So it was all very tough to do. Like you said, you can't just wave a magic wand and say you're going to do things and things change. The consistency in which we rolled this out and the consistency in which we lived out these values and qualities on a regular basis. And eventually when team members see the consistency here, they start leaning in and saying, okay, I'm in. What have I got to do? I've worked at a ton of different companies where people talked and didn't do any of that, or they let this leader misbehave or that leader misbehave. And it created all sorts of drama and problems. And at the end of the day, people say they're not doing what they say they're going to do. And that's what integrity is all about. It's just doing what you say you're going to do. And if the values are on the wall or they're on your cards or you're talking about them in your meetings, you better be living up to them the best you can if you want people to follow with passion and energy and bring everything they can to the business every day.
It can be very frustrating when you set your mind to something like, we're going to head in this direction. After a little while, maybe even after you think, hey, we've got this established, you begin to see violations of that culture that you want to have with the expectation, well, wait, hey, we said it and we've meant it to this point, and yet engaging with people to say, look, every violation is an opportunity to learn. How did you manage yourself along the way? Because I know lots of leaders can, okay, here's what this is going to look like, but it's frustrating, that time frame between here's where we are and here's where we want to be. How were you able to look at violations? And can you remember any in particular, like, oh yeah, okay, this is an opportunity where we all get to learn, but that road is not immediate?
Yeah, so when we started the values journey out, I was much the leader prior, where we were just like, win at all cost. It was go, go, go. If we ran over people and they couldn't keep up, we'd discard them and find somebody else that could keep up until they ran out of gas. I asked for people to say, hey, look, speak your mind, because if you can't speak your mind and have candor, which is one of our core values, then it's going to be tough sledding. But people stepped up and spoke their mind, and all I said was just, we all need to change and improve, and the journey to better leadership and the journey to better culture is going to be a never-ending one. It's going to be one where we're always taking steps. And right now the steps are, let's live out the values the best we can. And like you said, people are going to fail and make mistakes. And part of our culture is just having the grace to help people respectfully evolve and grow until they don't want to. And that's when we generally run into a problem where we have to make a tough decision or move somebody respectfully out of the organization, is when they decide they want to stop growing and developing. Because what we found out about culture is that you're in a constant state of growth and development. If you've got people that decide they don't want to, you're constantly pulling those people along, and that just makes it more difficult on everybody else. It makes the journey frustrating for other people. So we just ask people to be in it for the values and make sure that you're learning and developing and growing. And that's part of what that personal and professional growth plan is for, that we ask all of our team members to do. But one of the things I can say in the culture journey is that every time you take steps, for us, the first steps, like I said, were values and getting consistent there and holding people accountable. Once we did that, then the next handful of steps became apparent. We've just been on a journey of taking steps, and every year the next steps become apparent, what steps we need to take. And all I can say is we're a lot farther along today than we were 10 years ago when we first were just trying to figure what first steps to take.
That's really good. And it's helpful for those of us that are thinking about, okay, maybe we need to make a change in our organization as somebody's listening. It's not 27 steps at the same time. It's what's the first step. And for you guys, it was, okay, we're going to get real clear and real serious about core values, and then we're going to move from there. It might be a different first step for another organization, but fear not, you don't have to take 27 steps at the same time. You can take one at a time and build on that. When it comes to leadership development plans, you're talking about having those in writing with a lot of people in the organization, but I'm thinking about how I've watched most executive teams operate. And I'm just curious, what is the dynamic between you and the people who immediately report to you when it comes to developing these leadership development plans? What's the process and what role do you play in it?
I look at myself as kind of an accountability partner, and again, leading by example. So when I talk to anybody in the organization about leadership action plans, I just tend to lead with some of my goals and objectives. And that just lowers the anxiety and the stress level, because these conversations are hard. I mean, nobody's used to talking about personal and professional goals, family goals, health goals, whatever their goals are. I just usually try to break down the barrier and start with, hey, look, here's some of my goals. Here's what I'm working on. Just to show everybody that everybody's got things to work on. I think the biggest misconception about leadership action plans inside the business is, oh man, you're broke. You need to fix some things. So what are you working on? I always take the opposite approach and say, look, here's what I'm working on. This is why we're doing this, because we believe that if the business has 15,000 team members and all 15,000 of them are working on a leadership action plan, that is way better than the business that's got 15,000 people and 50 people are working on leadership action plans. Nobody argues that point. So why wouldn't we try to find the most effective way to get people to growing personally and professionally? And by the way, that helps them lead better at home. So it's good all the way around. It's good for everybody.
I love the way that you're willing to be beside your folks in that it's not just for them, it's also for you, but yet you're also willing to have the conversation. I find that there are a ton of top leaders in organizations who, for whatever reason, don't end up in those leadership development dialogue with their top folks. Perhaps they don't think it's their place, or, hey, look, just figure it out, or we'll get somebody else. Maybe that's the perspective. But there are so many times when the top leader is not directly involved in that dialogue. And I love that you are, and I think it's really unique that you are, and no doubt has an impact on setting the pace around the organization. So I think that's great.
And by the way, Tim, it's amazing when I go to my listening sessions every week. One of the things we talk about is we just invite people to share their leadership action plans just to get people comfortable that, hey, this is just what we do around here. Once you get done with your leadership action plan for 23, there's going to be one for 24, and there's going to be one for 25. And as long as you're around, we're going to encourage you to write your goals and objectives down for your life and for your work. But you wouldn't believe the kinds of things people get excited about sharing when they talk about the goals and objectives, some that they've accomplished or some that they're working on. I'd encourage all business leaders to jump into that. While it's scary and difficult and hard, it takes a lot of courage for the top leader and all the leaders to do. The results are fantastic because you're impacting people's lives in a real positive way.
And what's very apparent, Jason, as we talk, is that we're talking about how the organization can be better, but the impact is clearly much bigger than just the organization. You've mentioned a number of times families and spouses and kids and all of the fallout of becoming more well-developed as leaders and as people. It doesn't end within the confines of the organization, obviously. And a couple other things before we start to wrap up here. One is, I know that you have a perspective about what happens when you have a culture of highly engaged people, but maybe your go-to-market strategy is not the perfect, best strategy ever. versus an organization where, let's say, people are kind of disengaged, but we have a great business strategy. Talk to us a little bit how you see the difference between those two different types of organizations.
You need the right people and the right strategy, but culture is what makes those two other things perform really high. So if you have great people and a great strategy, certainly you have the opportunity to succeed and excel in business through that given strategy. But if you don't have a great culture, people are going to be leaving and dropping out. You're constantly be looking for new people to fill in the gap. So I would tell you that business strategy is really, really, really hard. I mean, a lot of people already know that. There's companies that just don't pick good people to execute strategies, and that's a problem in and of itself. But the one thing is for sure, you're likely going to keep people around longer if you've got a really good culture and leadership model in the business. If they're good people staying around longer, you're more likely to see momentum in quality and efficiency and safety and innovation like we talked about in the business. And those are the key metrics in the business. Nobody argues that those four metrics get better the longer people stay. Because if you got good people engaged over the long haul, and they're bringing passion and energy to work every day, quality, safety, efficiency, and innovation in the business gets better in every respect. So you can't have that without a great culture. People just won't stick around.
You're reminding me, I once heard the late Norman Schwarzkopf say, good people can make a bad plan work. In the midst of, as you're talking about culture, and a great culture will cause good people to stick around. And none of us are going to pick a bad plan on purpose. But I think all of us, if we're being honest, we spend any time in business at all, we can look back at some of our plans 5 years ago and you're like, ooh, wow, that was off. So how critical is it, this longevity that you're talking about? How important is it to have a culture that causes good people to stay so that when our business plans are not perfect, which they almost are always not perfect, how can we continue to have success? And it gets back to a culture that keeps good people around.
So one of the things I'd say is that culture is certainly going to be the fuel behind what keep great people to stay to fix that. And I believe that there's a lot of businesses that have faulty strategies and they have strategies that can be improved, but that's what having a great team's for. But again, you can't have a great team if they're not invigorated and energized by the kind of culture that the leaders create in the business, because people will leave. Because who wants to be miserable or at the very best feeling blah 40 or 50 hours a week in their job? Because that's just not how God wired us. He wired us to work and be productive, and we want to bring energy and create when we're doing our work. That's how we're wired. And if we're in a culture that doesn't allow for that, then that's where people leave and say, this isn't for me. I've got to find something else. But if the leadership is creating a values-centered, truly human leadership type culture, people will stick around, whether the strategy is good or bad, or good or not great. Great cultures with great people can make those strategies better, wherever it's at. Take it to the next level.
You mentioned those four measures, quality, safety, and innovation. What was the fourth one that I'm missing there in the list?
Efficiency in the business. So I always look at like a cell in our business that's building windows or furniture. You got 20 people in that cell with a leader, and one leader is leading really well with values at the center, creating a great culture for that team environment. The other one's not. And the other one's creating people to come in and out of that cell building furniture every day. How good is that furniture going to be? How quickly are you going to be building that furniture when you're constantly having to go hire somebody and bring somebody else in and train them? Or the cell that's going to keep those 20 people for 2 or 3 years maybe has a good system for transitioning when somebody wants to take a higher job and move out of that cell. They're going to usher them into a different position in the company and transition somebody else in really effectively versus I've seen it on both sides. And I can tell you that I wouldn't want to buy products that came from a business where there is high turnover, because you cannot possibly keep the best quality into the product and build quality into the product when people are coming and going all the time.
And who has more options than anybody is our very best people. They've got options. They don't have to stick around. They don't have to work for me when I'm not enjoyable to work for, not somebody who's got their best interests at heart. And so, yeah, there's plenty of options for our best people, and it's important for us to keep that in mind. As we wrap up here, we're going to look forward. We talked a little bit about 1997. We talked about 2013. We talked about the road between 2013 and today. As you look forward, what are some of the bigger challenges that you're looking at as a leader for the business in general, but also in terms of how you're wanting to grow and develop the leaders and culture of the organization?
Now that we're on a journey, our people in general that have been here for a long time, and again, our retention gets better and better every year because people want to stick around and see what's next. So It's not really a concern. It's just making sure that we're developing and showing our team members that strategy on what's next. We just said, hey, look, we do a lot of things well together when we lock arms, and caring for other people is one of our core values. How do we show people through a health and wellness initiative that we care about our people? So it's things like that. What are our next steps? One of our next steps as a business that I found our team members are really happy about is the fact that we're taking the culture that we've created and the steps we've created to get where we're at. And a lot of people in the community and around the country have, heard some of the things that we're doing, whether it's through a podcast or social media, through friends or through their networks. Just the fact that we're out talking to other businesses and telling them, hey, and being open to coach other businesses on how to have a better culture. Our team members have really connected the dots and said, our culture is helping other businesses get better. And those team members are starting to experience the improvement in their lives that we've experienced here in our lives. And that's a win for them. Like I said, I can tell you what the next couple of steps we decided to take, and business is the force for good, and showing other companies and businesses what good culture looks like and coach them how to get there because they've got a lot of questions. And then the second piece is, health and wellness and leadership action plans and continuing down that road and helping people realize that they have a purpose and help them find those purposes and their goals and objectives in life, write them down and write some action plans down. Those are the types of things that are really meaningful for team members. And there'll probably be a few other steps we've exposed in the journey. But with the leadership action plans, we're really excited about that just because of the stories that have come out where people have just said, hey, look, I'm going to do this or that. And I honestly believe they wouldn't have written this stuff down if we wouldn't carve out the time, sit with them face to face and say, hey, look, this is what we're going to do. This is how you're going to do it. We're going to help you through this process. And we're pulling stuff out of people that they've had buried for years and haven't thought about until they actually wrote it down on a sheet of paper. And that's magic. I think that's business is a force for good right there.
Boy, it really is, Jason. We can make the business argument for what you're talking about. And we have, as we talk about turnover and the reduction of turnover and what kind of impact that has when it comes to quality, safety, efficiency, and innovation. And yet, there's obviously more to the story, which is to say there's the business outcome for the organization, for a publicly traded company. But then there's the personal satisfaction that you and others get to experience by saying, hey, we're going to prioritize this. We're going to help everybody have a leadership development plan that's actionable, and we're going to help people experience growth and development that they probably, as in like 99% chance, would not have experienced if we weren't prioritizing this as an organization. I know you can't eat those stories or use them to pay your mortgage, but how valuable are they for us in terms of the satisfaction of leading that goes beyond the balance sheet? So is there anything that you want to make sure that we cover on that we haven't touched base on yet?
The biggest question people ask really are just, how does spending money on culture translate to the bottom line? Because that's what their boards are asking them, or that's what their CEO is asking. And there's a lot of people that below the CEO line that really want this change for the organization, and they just don't have the CEO support. And that's really tough. It's really tough to get a culture movement and journey going when you don't have the support of the board at the top level. So that's first and foremost. And if the CEO's not supporting, it's likelihood that you got the wrong person making those types of decisions. But people ask all the time, how do you translate this money you're spending on culture and the things that you're doing to the bottom line? And I say two things. One, you can't afford not to take care of people. You can't afford not to treat people like human beings and give them the dignity that they deserve when they're working 40 or 50 hours a week in your business. And the second thing is that you can absolutely put a price on turnover and efficiency savings that you get, and quality savings that you get, and safety savings you get, and innovation improvements you get in the business as a result of people staying longer because they want to be there. And then there's this really funny term that I've heard recently called dysfunctional retention. So then you have businesses that might not have a lot of turnover, but these people are coming to the business every day, but they're not engaging to the fullest that they can engage and bringing passion and energy and into the work that they do and to the people around them. You could argue that the business that has the same attrition and retention can have a whole different level of passion, energy, enthusiasm toward the business because of the culture versus another business that has more dysfunctional retention where people are just coming, punching the clock every day.
It's a great point. And there's all kinds of stats out there, most notably from Gallup, which is something that people will be very familiar with, around engagement versus kind of just being in that middle space. and active disengagement. And we're in the very low percentages here around the world globally. It's a little higher here in the US. It was previously in the 30% range, but think about that. Is there a strategic advantage from a business standpoint to having more highly engaged people in the organization? Yes, there is.
But you know what businesses do, Tim? They want to wave the magic wand to solve the problem and point to the values or say, hey, we've got a great culture, or try to convince people they've got a great culture, but what resources are they really putting in place to make sure? And that's what I always ask business leaders is, okay, you've got a great culture. Tell me where you're putting your resources there.
I'm Tim Spiker, reminding you to be worth following and to follow us wherever you receive your podcasts. If you've heard something valuable today, please share our podcast with your friends and colleagues. And if you're up for it, leave us a 5-star review. Thanks for listening.